Okay, we are on. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today is November 30, 2022. This is one of the last meetings of the year. We are going to still have one more. This is SIG API Machinery for Kubernetes open source. We are doing our bi-weekly meeting, and we have a nice agenda today. We are going to get started with the presentation, and then there is a number of topics and updates we are going to go through. So first one is Jared. You were trying to see if you could present. Can you confirm or deny? Otherwise, I can present. You're muted. There you go.
For some reason, if I present, I cannot unmute myself, which is very strange.
So do you want me to? I can open this and present. You can tell me.
There is a Zoom bug. You have to share the whole window instead of a tab.
Okay. Actually, just prefer if you can help me with that.
Yes. Can people see if I put in presentation mode? Do you still see? Everybody sees?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So hello everyone. This is Jiahuif or Jared. I'm having a mini presentation talking about type system for CEL. Next slide, please. So as a context, we are merging a new feature in 1.26, which is validating admission policy. So just imagine if you want to eliminate the replicas of a deployment instead of a webhook that takes the deployment and check if the replicas is smaller than a given number, we can have this neat validating admission policy rule. So see, in this rule, we are saying like we have a reference to a CRD, which is replica limit, and we are going to compile the replicas of a given deployment to see if the replicas is less or equals to the one that is defined in the CRD. So notice that we have two structured information. We have two structured objects in this validation components, which the first one is deployment, second one is the CRD. Next slide, please. So the problem is as of 1.26, we treat everything as unstructured because we didn't got enough time to implement the whole type system. So everything is unstructured, then we are not going to do any type checking when compiling the CEL expressions, and the parms, which is the referred CRD, are unstructured, which is like map string any when evaluating the expression. So we are going to change that, and the first one we are going to do is that we are going to use OpenAPI Schema to compile and evaluate the CEL expression. The schemas are discovered at runtime because they are CRD support, and we are going to use OpenAPI V3 instead of OpenAPI V2. And we may fall back to V2 or the compiled in built-in schemas because OpenAPI V3 is a beta feature as of 1.26, and maybe next feature, and maybe next release. So if the user disable that, we need some kind of fallback. Like for example, we are going to fall back to V2 or the OpenAPI specs compiled into the API server. Next slide, please. So why do we need schemas? So first, when we are compiling the CEL expression, we will check the missing or misspelled fields. So for example, if we misspelled something like spec, we forget the spec. Say instead of object.spec.replicas, we say object.replicas. We can check that as a compile error instead of a runtime error. Type confusions too. We cannot treat replicas as a string. And don't forget, we have Kubernetes specific extensions to OpenAPI, like interstring, embedded resource, and also associated list type. So how do that work? Next slide, please. So here is an example. At runtime, we are going to resolve the type of the referred object. We will find, okay, that is a deployment. Then we will fetch the OpenAPI schema from the API server. It's actually API extension server, but we will fetch the spec of deployment. Then, okay, David, please.
So when you say runtime, are you talking about something that happens like as a controller when it sees changes to CRDs, or when it sees changes to the OpenAPI schema and it was set a condition? Or when you say runtime, do you mean when a deployment is submitted and this expression actually gets used?
The deployment is if the deployment goes into the API server. So we do have to watch this resource because that's for another reason. But for the schema resolution, we do that when deployment coming.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So and that is how we resolve the deployment type from the API schema. And next slide, please. Then we will find spec, which is of type deployment spec, but it's actually a reference, so we have to find that in the return documentation again. Next slide, please. Then we have a schema of deployment spec, and we can see all the properties of it, like replicas. We can see that is an integer of type or format int32. Then we are going to next step. We are going to resolve the field replicas. Yeah, like that. We can see replicas is an integer and of type int32, and that's the whole process of resolving replicas. The same thing goes for parms. Next slide, please. So we are going to use OpenAPI V3. That's a recap. So what is the benefit of OpenAPI V3? Because it can discover both built-in types and CRDs. That's true for V2 too. And then it is grouped by API is grouped by group version. For example, if we try to get V3 APS apps we want, then we only returns everything that we need for group apps instead of every single schemas the API server knows of. And it's self-contained, which means the whole return documentation contains everything we need to resolve the type. So for example, deployments have a reference to pod spec, but pod spec is in another group. But for API V3, it has both the deployment spec and pod spec, everything we need in one single document. So why don't we just look at it as the built-in types? The compiled in types. We do have compiled in OpenAPI schema. That is because so that is a common question when I design that. So because the API V3 needs a HTTP request to the loopback interface, and it's a beta feature. Next slide, please. So
there is a question in the chat about OpenAPI.
Okay, so one is so that is kind of that is why I say we may need a fallback. So if OpenAPI V3 goes GA before our feature goes to, for example, beta, then we can depend that in next release. But to be honest, I don't really have a very good idea of how or when OpenAPI V3 is going to GA. And sorry for that.
This one was primarily Jeffrey and Stefan, right? I'm not aware.
Antoine.
I'm not aware of stable graduation criteria, but I'm also not aware of disagreement, which probably means no one has.
I would expect the OpenAPI V3 to go GA stable before the CEL work gets to alpha or like finishes the alpha.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any blockers for the IV3 going stable.
So if that is the case, I can say we don't need a fallback anymore.
Yeah, so, I think by the I understand there's like 3 phases of work for CEL. By the time you get to the last one, OpenAPI V3 should be GA. But you should propagate that to Antoine to make sure that everybody knows that is necessary.
Thank you for the question. So next step. So for the next release, or maybe the release after next release, we are going to have a we are going to cache the parse schemas because the schema parsing may take a lot of time if the cat. So, and it's actually involving a caching invalidating system. So if we see a change to CRDs, we are going to invalidate the corresponding cached parsed schemas. And for the lazy loading part, so say we have referred to something and then we refer that again. Currently, we just resolve the whole schemas. We just resolve the whole schema. For example, deployment. We will resolve every field of deployment, but an expression may not refer to every field of the deployment. For example, if we resolve replicas, we don't want to resolve pod spec type because we never mentioned containers. Pods or containers in our expression. Then in next release, we will just resolve that lazily instead of eagerly. In this way, we can save some time, but I need more benchmark on the data. I need more benchmark data on this topic. And that's everything I need to say. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your time. Any questions?
The only question I had, Jared, I think this makes sense what you're trying to do. It wasn't clear to me in the presentation. Is it possible to avoid the loop back and instead like wire in whatever we have in memory that serves discovery, so we can kind of pull from that data set instead of like looping back?
That's the comparison of using the built-in type, the compiled in OpenAPI schema. So as a context, we do have get API definition, get OpenAPI definitions. So the main idea is because if we do that, if we discover that at the runtime, we can have CRDs for free. One path code for both built-ins and CRDs. And David?
I was also going to say that while the Kube API server keeps track and serves OpenAPI definitions for but all the groups, aggregated API servers do not, but you would still expect them to honor validating admission policies, since they could have them defined for their types. So I think doing the read is necessary for that behavior to function.
Doing the read. Okay, I'll take a note on that. Thank you for the hint. Open aggregator.
One thing I was trying to work out here. You're keeping track, I guess, of when the OpenAPI schema has changed, so you don't have to recompile the expression for every evaluation, or am I misunderstanding how CEL works and compilation and checks like this are fast? And then a follow-on to that is when it fails, how will the author of the validating admission policy know that it is failing?
So unfortunately, we do compile that every time a resource comes in or the validating rules are evaluated. That's why. So every time, for example, the deployment example, every time a new deployment comes in, the expressions will be compiled again, but we have catches. That is because a rule can apply to multiple resources. For example, we can, could you reopen the slides and go to the second slide? Sorry for that. We can see the example here, second slide. So second one, see, this one. So match constraints, there's a resource, you see resource deployments. So it can apply to multiple resources. For example, if somebody really want, we can add something else, or maybe star. So everything that is in the apps group, it will the expression we're going to evaluate against. So yeah, so the compilation is when the validating admission policy is used. And the second part of the question is like, how do the author of the admission policy know when a compile error occurs? Unfortunately, that is going to return when the deployment comes in. It's not when the validated admission policy is created. That's a limitation of our design. So yeah, so compile error and runtime error will both be returned when the deployment coming?
Yeah, to add a couple things there. So because we can't know for sure whether or not, when we did CRD validation rules, like you had the schema and the rules all in the same object. And so you could do a really strict type check and say, if these things don't match up, like give a type error right away, just reject the attempt to update the CRD. In this case, like somebody might create a admission policy, but it might go into different clusters and they might have different versions of a built-in type, but do or do not have a field. And so what we've decided to do is not make any type checking like a blocking error. So it's going to be what we're calling informational type checking. We're thinking of putting it in the status so you can know about it and see it, and you could do things with it and try and make sense of it. But we're not going to try and block requests from it. Even if we don't do anything up front with type checking, we still benefit at runtime from knowing more about the types, because we can treat them all very properly. Like if it's an interstring and we know that, then we get more correct and consistent behavior at runtime with that. So you can think of the runtime data that's being passed in as being annotated with type information. CEL is examining that during runtime.
So informational status seems really useful to me. Is the same technique that was described here, pull the schemas, figure out where it all navigates to, resolve the pieces, is that same technique going to be used to build the informational status messages?
Yes. The idea is that like once we find any type errors, using that process already described, that would be used to put stuff in the status about the informational type error.
That sounds good, because then the author who actually owns this would be made aware, or could be aware. And
exactly.
we have a thing to fix.
Yeah.
Because the person who gets the error message about this, he can't do anything to fix it. So
right. Yeah.
okay. Thanks.
Steve?
If you find a type error and you add it to status, does the validation rule still get run? What's
yes.
the behavior there?
So, sorry. So if it's compile rules, then we just say it is a failure, and we are going to look at the failure policy. If that is failed, then we return error or ignore. We can just go on.
Yeah, a concrete example that might be that you reference some field that was added to deployments in Kubernetes 1.29, which doesn't exist yet. But in the future, somebody adds that, but then in 1.28, that field doesn't exist. So technically, you'll get a type error if you try and type check it, if you put it in an older version of a Kubernetes cluster. But somebody might still have some like safety checks to guard against that field not being there. And so you could actually have something that fails to compile, but because it's being checked at runtime to see if that field is set, then it would actually at runtime run safely in both versions. So it would be possible to write code that is runtime safe that does fail a type check.
That's a really good example. And if that's not already in the KEP, if you wouldn't mind just adding it for the future. Not a requirement,
yes,
not a requirement to implement this piece, but that's a very good example.
Yeah, I'll get that written down.
Yeah, definitely update to the KEP. Good point.
And maybe even for docs, just thinking about it, like a person who sees that message and is looking and saying, but my expression is safe to run. I can imagine that doc being helpful to someone at Red Hat explaining why we should accept their change.
Yeah, I could imagine some cluster administrators get pretty wary of those status errors, and that's a really good point.
And anybody else?
I just wanted to say that I saw that Antoine now joined the call, and there were some discussion about when OpenAPI V3 was going to be GA and what are the plans, in case we need some extra information.
Yeah, I can add something to this. So we wanted to have some good usage of OpenAPI V3 before going GA. And we have kubectl explain that uses V3 in 1.26, which is going to go probably better in the next release in 1.27. So I think we can the plan is to make OpenAPI V3 GA in 1.27.
That's great.
Great. Thank you, Antoine.
No problem.
Okay, if there are no more questions for Jared, thank you for the presentation. Super good.
Thank you.
We move to the next one.
Questions?
Okay, team, are you ready?
Yeah, I'll try and keep this short. We talked about this a little bit last, I guess 2 weeks ago, and I just wanted to briefly follow up on that. I opened this PR not with the intent of merging it, but just to illustrate a little more concretely what we're discussing. So there's three, I guess just very briefly to back up for folks who don't have context on this. There's a KEP for adding contextual logging, which means adding a logger to the context object. And then you can attach additional information, names and values to that logger. And then instead of calling like the static clog dot whatever to do your logging, you grab the logger off of the context and call the equivalent log methods on that, and then it comes with those additional values. And so the goal here is to attach audit ID to logs in the request path, which would let us associate any logs or like errors or information or anything that happens in the request with a specific request. Yeah, if you want to go back to the PR here, there's 3 commits here. The first is just demonstrating how we would go about adding the audit ID. So rather than needing to go through every log line in the API server and add audit ID, we can just attach it to a logger in the context. Oh, I see Patrick commented recently. We'll have to go through that. Yeah, so this is kind of what it looks like to set it up. And if you go to the next commit here, the conversion of structured logging is, when there's a context available, is really straightforward. And this could be done kind of mechanically or statically. We wouldn't need to, there's no changes to the actual log itself. We're just changing to grab a logger from the context, and the method name changes slightly. And then if you go to the third commit, that's kind of where there's a bit more of an open question. What do we do with all of the log lines that aren't structured? Because the contextual logger only accepts structured logs format. So there's kind of 3 options I put in here. The first is we just say they're out of scope for now. We're not going to touch them, at least in this release. We'll figure out something in the future. The second option is to just use format.sprintf to take the exact line that we were logging before and just make that the message. So we're not rewriting the log. This does change slightly how it gets logged in the format. It means that the context from the contextual logger would still be included. And then the line also gets wrapped in quotes just because of the structured logging format.
It also, wait, doesn't this also have an injection problem in that the and line 99 here, the result of thumps.sprintf is treated as a format? Oh, it's not. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, and then the third option is to actually rewrite the log line and make it match more closely the structured logging format.
Now you have an easy one here, but normally that involves breaking apart all the parameters for what's getting printed, and you actually name them all. And then when you look at the diff, you see a diff that has a string and then the name of the thing and then the thing and the name of the thing and the thing and the name of the thing and the thing, making the review in general kind of a pain.
When I was looking for a good example to illustrate this, a couple things. One, I found that a lot of the usages of the format style logs were actually outside the request path. And so those would be most likely out of scope for this. I don't think there's a context present there, and we wouldn't need to change those. And yeah, I guess that was kind of the main point there.
I would have appetite for option 2 and plumbing a context through our methods doesn't offend my sensibilities. Daniel, I saw the look. Would you prefer to review them going all the way to option 3? I mean, I assume that's the design.
No, I prefer option 1.
Okay.
Option 2 is very ugly. Option 3 seems very hard to review carefully, and option 1 seems best, and we can fix them as we feel like it in the future.
Yeah, so I guess my proposal for 127 is to include basically commits, the first commit, add the audit ID to the contextual logger. And then basically in methods where there is a context already and it's using structured logging, we switch to the contextual logger. I think plumbing the context through would be out of scope for the initial pass. And I'm also okay with keeping so kind of doing the minimal change here, and then slowly iterating on maybe kind of a case-by-case basis where there's a log that specifically would benefit from that additional context, then we can address that.
Yeah, that sounds fine. Mo has a hand.
I was gonna ask, is there a reason we can't make the contextual logger just support the old format so we don't have to go change stuff? At least
I was wondering that too, actually.
There's very strong opinions on this from the maintainers.
Okay.
It also doesn't have a warning function.
Add one.
I suspect that gets into other strong opinions.
I mean, just I'm just trying to think about like actually making this a success, and
right,
if smaller is how you get success here.
Is this contextual logger something owned? Who owns this contextual logger code?
Isn't this Tim Hawken? It's
well,
his thing, right?
Yeah, it's a few
I was going to suggest wrapping it. I mean, if they don't want it, you know, we can do our own wrapper, but maybe not.
There's a structured logging working group, and this is all under the umbrella of SIG instrumentation. There is a logger external library interface that's owned by Tim Hawken. That is what, it's the type of this the logger you see here. And so I think it's going to be an uphill battle to try and add format string logging to that interface.
I mean, the theory is not to have extra allocations there. Like if you'd like to allocate the string, do so, but the interface wants to be.
Oh, is that the theory? I thought the theory was to force you to make it structured so it's easier to read.
Oh, maybe both. I don't know. But I guess, is there any expectation that the structuredness will come potentially like out of
like
bandings?
on the allocating thing? I don't think this helps, right? Because this is a series, it's a slice of empty interface, right? Like Go has
but
to
you
work
don't have,
really hard.
but you don't have to construct a string with everything plugged in.
No, I understand that. So I understand it. Having a format version allocates more, but this is not like a zero allocation panacea, this interface, right? Like if you look at the low level zap logger interface, that's how you get no allocations. It sucks. It's like unusable for a human.
I guess aside from contextual stuff, is there any expectation that existing logs will be structured in the future, sort of orthogonally to this effort?
I think that depends on who's doing the expecting.
I think the expectation is that eventually Kubernetes will move to structured logging, and also that new log lines should be in a structured format. But
so a capitulation here that only changes things that are easily changeable is, eventually ends up being the right thing, right?
All right, I think we should probably time box this and move on. Is there anything you feel unclear about, Tim?
No, I think I think starting with the minimum viable approach of changing sort of the easy, straightforward log lines kind of unblocks progress in 127, and then we can kind of on a case-by-case basis consider more. I feel good with that. But.
All right, cool. Steve, you got a hand up?
Yeah, sorry, one thing I realized, I don't know, Tim, if anyone's already putting the audit ID into their logs, but I guess because of the way that the feature flag gets turned on, you can't remove it for now, right? Since contextual is off until 27.
Mm-hmm. I think the main place that we see that is in the HTTP log, but that's kind of its whole own thing, and so I wouldn't want to convert that to a contextual logger.
Mo?
This just reminded me, this is for audit ID, right, Tim?
Yeah.
Are we gonna solve the maybe I'll put air quotes around the word problem of the fact that I can specify audit ID by just sending a header and the API server will just use it?
We should address that separately. I see that as more of a security consideration and not like a debuggability consideration from the purposes of debug logs.
Right. I guess
that seems important to fix. Can we do that in the next release and backport it maybe?
Yeah, it's unclear to me why the feature exists, and
that doesn't sound like a feature.
Well, I think it was there to make aggregated API servers chain correctly, but it's not correctly built for that.
So like as long as it is possible to chain, then it seems fine to adjust. But the goal, right, is to be able to say, okay, this propagated from here to there. This is how you can make the connection between the two. And if you have different correlation spheres, right, like you have, I came in and I had this ID, and this was the audit ID that someone told me, I don't trust it. This is my own internal or my own ID that I'm writing out, but here's the suggested parent. That seems fair.
I think if we want, it sounds like a good feature for the same request chain to end up with related audit IDs. But if we're going to trust an audit ID in a header, I think it needs to come with a signature or an HMAC of some API server, right? Not a user.
Is that a breaking change at this point, though?
You mean adding information and then only honoring the header if the information matches? Yes.
I mean, saying that clients can no longer set an arbitrary audit ID.
I think we should discuss this in an issue.
Okay. I think there's already an open issue for it somewhere.
Okay. Maybe you can tag me or the SIG or something
Sure.
in it. That'd be good. Should we move on? I guess I'm up. I think the first one is just a last session, John Howard mentioned how hard it was to verify that informer, like things using shared informers have synchronized, that is, seen all of the contents of the collection. I didn't care for those options, so I wrote up a PR that hopefully fixes it. And indeed, many of our controllers have a problem. Like they could be saying they're synced before they've actually processed all the items in the collection. So I've fixed some controllers there, and anyone who is interested can take a look at that PR, which doesn't, it changes the interface, but not in a way that's going to break client code for the most part. So it should be very low impact. All right, that's it for that. The next one, this is just an update on the fine-grained auth. Since we last talked about it, I incorporated a fix to David's changes, or David's list of issues. It's not the fix that, well, I'm not sure David had a fix in mind, but basically it separates the declaration of which permissions are uncovered from the schema and puts it in a separate object so that it is up to the individual cluster and that cluster's administrator whether a given permission is included in the generic permission or not. So that if a given cluster wished to be more secure than upstream, they could separate out a permission and declare, like, you know, to do such and such a thing, you have to explicitly have this permission. It's not good enough to have the general permission. That's no longer in the schema in this design.
Okay, and that would actually allow, that would make it easier to allow type reuse if in other contexts. If somebody,
correct.
Yep. All right. I like
Yeah.
that.
Let's see. It seems like I changed one other thing, which was and I also changed the definition of like uncovered to mean like even if you have like a metadata permission, if some particular label is in the list of things that are uncovered, like not only does it mean that the general permission doesn't cover it, it means that recursive granular permissions don't cover it either. Yeah, making that possible to do correctly. All right, I think that's all I had to say on that. And I accidentally put this on the SIG auth agenda a meeting or two ago and forgot to actually show up. So I will try to actually show up and we can discuss in more detail for the next SIG auth meeting. Steve.
Yep, sorry. Just super quick update. I was able to make PRs to all the places that I found people parsing resource version. There's two camps. The first camp is folks that were either doing something like, I don't know, bizarre, or they were trying to work around some other issue. Those PRs are either merged or will soon be merged. And there's a second class of people who were actually trying to solve the mutation cache issue, which obviously there's no solution for. So, you know, just a quick update that from my understanding, the set of people actually doing this parsing is now going to be much smaller.
Awesome, thank you. Fede.
Well, yes, just housekeeping. Our next meeting is going to be December 14th, and this will be the last meeting of this year. We're going to cancel December 28th because a lot of people is out, hopefully recharging, resting. And then after the December 14th one, we will meet again in January, and by the schedule is January 11th. So just a heads up, if there is something that can't wait until next year, make sure that you make it to the agenda within the next 2 weeks, okay? That's all for now. Anything else? No? Very good. Thank you everybody for coming, for the great discussions, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. I will upload the recording later today. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.